So just DJ and I in the studio today. So we're going to pick up where we left off last week. Gian sent in a question that we almost got to, but we ran out of time last week, so I don't want to leave him hanging.
Oh no, Dizzle's going to be so
I know, that's actually
pissed that he's not here for it.
I know. It'll be good, because he'll have to just sit there and listen to it on his own and have all these remarks that he wish he would have weighed in on, but he could have been here, so oh well. All right, so Gian says, "Hi guys, I have a question regarding my VO2 max and threshold. I'm 20 years old and I do mountain bike races. As you can see attached," and he attached his let's see, he did like some testing with Velo Coach, and I don't know if that's his coach or if it's a different program, but anyways, as you can see, my VO2 max is pretty high compared to other athletes. On the other hand, my threshold in relation to my VO2 max is not very great. I already discussed this with my coach, and he told me that probably the best way to increase my efficiency is by doing FTP intervals. I know that Zone 2 training also benefits efficiency, but the mountain bike season is in full swing, and I can't really do more TSS during race weeks. I train 14 hours on average, plus 1 to 2 gym sessions per week. On weeks without races, the most I do is about 20 hours. Last August, I had already more or less similar results, as you can see on the file. So he sent a couple of years worth of data here. I just have the feeling that I'm not really making a lot of progress and thought that you guys could maybe take a look at this. Thanks in advance. Love your podcast. Always listen on my training rides. Greetings from Switzerland. Yeah. So to start with, Gian has a VO2 max of 81. So not average.
Yeah, no, well above average.
Yeah.
Yep.
A lot of the data that he sent was in a different language. I'm guessing Swedish.
Okay.
So I did not translate that in any way. So I was mostly just looking through the data. But yeah, I mean, he's got incredibly high VO2 max, relative VO2 max. He's, let's see, for some metrics sakes, he is 66 kilos, 178 centimeters. So I don't know what that is off.
I think that's like 5'10".
Yeah, exactly.
I know that because I'm 5'10".
Okay, nice. And then, yeah, he's got 9% body mass, so, or 9% body fat. So, you know, pretty lean dude. So in general, I mean, he's built like a cyclist, right? He's fairly lean, fairly tall, high VO2 max, but his FTP is like 327 watts, which isn't bad. Like that's not a bad FTP, but that puts him like just under 5 watts per kilo.
Yep.
So I guess what Gian is questioning is whether or not the approach or the advice that he's been given from his coach, and we don't want to like step in here and completely undermine what his coach is saying, obviously, but his coach is basically just telling him go out and do more FTP intervals. What are your thoughts for someone with what you would consider a relatively high potential in the sport, given genetic potential with VO2 max? He's only 20 years old, so he's relatively young, I would say, as well. But what are your thoughts on training approach in a case like this?
Well, I don't necessarily know that just going out and doing more FTP intervals is the right advice. Especially, I very much stick to polarized or pyramidal training, and that's the advice that I give, meaning that generally speaking, you're doing 2 intensity sessions a week, and FTP intervals count as intensity sessions. Tempo intervals count as intensity sessions. Anything over zone 2 counts as an intensity session. I would say that the research suggests that anything more than that is probably not beneficial, and not only is it not beneficial, you may actively be hurting your progress by crossing the line into overtraining. So I don't necessarily know that that's good advice. I think that what I will say is that given his age And I'm assuming, does he give his training age, meaning how many years he's been training?
No, he does not. That's a great question, because I think that is definitely relevant, but he does not.
Yeah. So I don't think he's hit his potential yet. And I mean, just by the fact that he's 20 years old, he hasn't hit his potential yet. I mean, he's going to get faster
Yeah.
at 20. Yeah, there's a reason why they have a U23 category in cycling, and it's because a lot of progress is made in your early 20s. And we could talk about specifics of what to do with training, but I think that even if you continue training the way that you are, you're going to see progress in the next 3 years, because you haven't hit your potential yet, both by your age and by these metrics that you're showing us. I don't think you've hit your potential yet. I think there's definitely untapped potential there.
Yeah. I agree. So, one other thing to keep in mind too is, Gian here is specifically calling out the fact that he's got a what he would consider to be a relatively low FTP compared to his VO2 max potential. But I'd be curious to see what are some other aspects. So I actually, I was looking at the data sheet a little bit more here, and there is a couple. There's not a true power distribution chart, but he does have, let's see, 30-second power, 3-minute power, and 12-minute power. And his 3-minute power is 488 watts. Which
you would expect. So you would expect that from somebody who's got a high VO2 max.
Yes.
For their 3 to 5 minute power to be high.
Very high. Yeah.
And honestly, I can see why he's worried about it. It's not uncommon for a 20-year-old to have a low FTP relative to their VO2 max. They don't have enough training history to have a high FTP relative to their VO2 max yet.
Yeah, I agree. And that's where I think, we don't have a ton of insight into what Gian's goals are, or what, even what racing, what level he's currently racing at. But he's in Switzerland, so we can make the assumption that there's probably a pretty high level of competition that he's competing against. And I'd be curious to just know, how is he performing in some of these races? Where does he feel like he's lacking in ability compared to the field that he's racing against? And what are some things that you can do to leverage your strengths right now to, get the race performances that you want, while also in training trying to hone some of your weaknesses? Because a lot of times, that's really what it comes down to is, you can't prepare all the time 100%, across all different, energy systems, and, cover all of the bases, so you can over time do some of that in training, but come race day, you kind of have to just play to your strengths. You don't want to just lean into your weaknesses. That's not going to get you the results you want. So I'd be kind of curious to know, what is he doing to try and improve his current ability, in, racing and performing, while, so maybe his coach is onto something, and that hey, you just haven't, maybe in training he just hasn't done a lot of threshold work to this point, so maybe his coach isn't saying you need to go out and do 5 days of threshold this week, but more so just saying we need more time spent at threshold.
Yeah. Also, I think that in the micro, it can be easy to think that you're not making progress. Let's say you have an FTP test in April, and then in March you have another FTP test, and you didn't improve at all.
Yeah.
Or maybe even your FTP went down. It's easy to be like, oh man, I'm stagnating. It's been a month and I haven't made any progress. And sometimes I can distinctly remember times in my life where I felt that way, and I was like, man, it's been a month or it's been 2 months and my FTP hasn't gone up 1 single watt. What am I doing?
Right.
What have I been doing the last 2 months? It seems like such a waste of time and effort that I've made no fitness progress. And it, but then I think especially when you're at that age in particular, when you zoom out, I would be shocked if progress isn't being made on a more macro level. And I think I'll just use myself as an example. I think when I was, I mean, I'd have to go back in my training peaks, but when I was 20 years old, maybe I could do, for a 20-minute test, maybe I could do 340 watts, maybe. And there were a lot of times where, I'd train for a month or I'd train for 2 months and it'd be 340 again. And I'd be like, well, that was a waste of time, like I just said. But when I zoom out now, 10 years later, I'm 30 years old. Now I can do over 400 watts for 20 minutes. Right. So there's been improvement. It's just slow and incremental. And I think, once you get past the first year or two, progress really does come slowly and incrementally. Yes. And you just have to kind of keep that in mind sometimes.
Yeah. So if you look at that example, say it was 340 back when you were 20. So 10 years later, I don't know what it is now, say 420 maybe or something like that, right?
414 was my last one.
Okay. Yeah. So you're only talking 75 watts increase. Mm-hmm. Now that I'm not trying to minimize that, but you're talking 75 watts over 10 years. Mm-hmm. So if you extrapolate that, that's an average of 7.5 watts per year. That's almost like within the margins of error, you could say, to where like you might even have a test 1 year to the next year that like just due to error in the testing could look mm-hmm. like you had made zero progress. But you have to take that and extrapolate that out over many years before you can really start to see that measurable improvement. And that's really what you're up against once you get to the point where you're like pushing the ceiling of what your like potential is. It's not to say that you've reached your potential, but it's like you're starting to get close to that of like what mm-hmm. your body can currently handle. You probably also, when you were 20 years old, couldn't do back-to-back 35-hour weeks while still like as part of your prep for an A race, right? Like that would have probably put you in a hole for a long time. So it's like you also have to like work with what your body can currently handle too. And, in Gion's case here, it's like, 20, training up to 20 hours a week that's a lot of training, but you're also only 20. Think about what could happen when you're 25, when you're 27, mm-hmm. like 5 to 7 years from now. 20 hours will probably be pretty easy for you to accommodate if you continue to train at a consistent level like this. Whereas right now, 20 hours may be kind of pushing the limits of what your body can handle.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I would say, try to, you're at a young age, like you always want to be working on things that are strengths and weaknesses. Like you want to try and cover the whole spectrum of what's necessary to compete. But I would try to lean into some of your strengths right now too. Don't let your weaknesses overshadow what your current strengths are, because that 3-minute power of close to 500 watts, like you should be able to do some damage with a 3-minute power like that.
Yeah, no doubt. Sometimes we talk about, is it even useful knowing your VO2 max? Because if it's high, if it's low, what can you do about it? Just kind of lets you know if you have potential. I think at the very least, that you have potential. The potential is there. It should be. Now, VO2 max is not the only thing that matters by far. I mean, there's other factors to consider, and there's other physiological stopping points that could stop you from reaching your potential. But at the very least, that's not a hindrance to you, and you should have a high potential. And if you continue training correctly for, I would say, if you're 20 years old, for the next 5 years, I just given what we know about you, I wouldn't be surprised if you could approach 6 watts per kilo or even go over 6 watts per kilo at some point in your life.
Yeah. It's going to take some time to get there. And that's hard to stomach sometimes, because we all want immediate results, or even not necessarily immediate, but we want to see progress in the real time. And, in some cases you're not going to start to see, like, reap some of those rewards for years down the road. And you just have to be confident in in the fact that what you're doing today is going to benefit you 3 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Will Gian come back to us in a few years and let us know what happened? Because yeah, it'd be cool to see with the VO2 max potential. I mean, there's a lot of opportunities there. So good luck with it, and yeah, we hope the best for you. Let's move on to a question here. This is from DJ, and he says, "No, not that DJ." DJ says, "Hey y'all, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on having a B/C race land on a rest week. I currently have my calendar set up with mesocycles consisting of 3 weeks on, 1 week off, leading up to a summer peak at my A event on July 6th. However, a couple of B/C races that I want to do with a new team this spring line up on what would be my rest weeks. I can shift things around by adding an additional on week to one of my mesocycles, which would get 2 of the 3 races back into my on weeks, but I can't avoid the third one being on a rest week without totally messing up the rest of my plan. Do you think it's all right to do one of these training races with my team during a rest week 1 month before my A race, or is that just asking for trouble with fatigue leading into my more important goal for the year? I'm trying to balance having fun with racing with my new team while keeping my eye on the prize of winning my A race for them. I podiumed this race last year, racing solo against a team of 6, so I'm confident I can win it this year if I come in with good form and with the help of a couple teammates. For reference, most of these races will be in the 3 to 4 hour range. If you think it would be all right to throw this race onto the calendar, what adjustments would you recommend surrounding this race to account for the lack of a full rest week? Thanks, DJ.
Sweet. Good question, DJ.
Yeah.
Yeah. So having a B or C race at the end of a rest week, I would say is actually ideal. Like that's the ideal. It doesn't always work out that way, and sometimes your training just falls how it falls, and you can't necessarily plan around these B and C races. But in a perfect world, you taper for your A race, but then you've got a B or C race at the end of a rest week, which you've effectively tapered for. So
Yep.
you can kind of see how you perform in a tapered state before your A race. It's actually a good opportunity for you to practice a taper. Because a lot of people screw up a taper, and either they taper too long, or they didn't do enough hard intervals during the taper, or maybe their taper was too short and they're still fatigued. This is all stuff that you can practice if you have a rest week before a B or a C race. So I think there's a couple differences between a taper and a rest week. Like you wouldn't want to just take a complete rest week, meaning a bunch of easy zone 1 rides going into a race. The main difference is just that you're still going to be doing easy zone 1 rides, but a couple days in there, you're going to have sort of opener efforts. So certainly maybe the day before or 2 days before, you're going to have some openers where openers can vary. And I don't think it's necessarily super important what specific openers you do, but an example might be you do 5-minute efforts where or like 2 5-minute efforts where you're going from threshold to VO2 max. So you're starting the effort at threshold, and then you're ramping up the VO2 max by the end of the effort. And you only do 2 of those, so you're not tired at the end of that. Like you're just ready to go.
Yep.
And you could also throw something like that in midweek. So like on a Wednesday or a Tuesday before a Saturday race, do a VO2 max session, but instead of doing 5x5, do 3x5. You know, something that's not gonna completely tire you out, but you're gonna be firing on all cylinders by race day because you've been doing a few snappy efforts in the week. And as far as like B or C race in a recovery week goes, I think if it's a C race, you may want to prioritize recovery and just do a straight recovery week leading into the C race with the idea that you're going to be maybe a little flat on the starting line. It's not a big deal because it's a C race. But I think a B race, you could actually potentially adjust what you do in the last week of training so you're not completely smoked. So you need a full recovery week, and then you could actually practice an A race taper leading into a B race.
Yep.
The only reason why I'm hesitant to say that for a C race is because I think if you do a big training block and you come into this taper week absolutely blown to bits, what you need is an actual recovery week, not a taper week.
Yeah.
So that's the only thing that I would kind of clarify there. I think that
and the reason is because you're probably going to perform better coming off of a taper week than a true rest week, just because you might be a little flat coming off of a full-blown rest week, right?
Yeah.
So if it's a C race and you're truly treating it like a C race, which a C race means you actually don't really care what the result is, you're still going to perform your best. Like on the day of, you can still go out and race it, 110% effort. But at the end of the day, if you get first place versus, 19th place, you don't really care. You can just write that off as, hey, this was a training day. So whatever you need to do to come into that day to be set up most for your big picture, which would be like your A race, you do that. Meaning you're not going to skew or change your rest week around. You're just going to do a rest week because that's what it calls for.
Yeah. B race is like kind of, I would say, you sort of care about the result, but also it's a training race, right? It's sort of in the middle.
I like B races to be considered more of like preparatory events. So training races, you can tinker with stuff. You don't really care what happens. You can try new tires, or you can try new openers the day before. You can try new nutrition, and if things backfire, it's just a learning experience, and a hard training day. B races, I tend to want an athlete to use as more of like, okay, this is what we think we're going to do for race day, on your A event. Like, let's try it and see if it's bulletproof. And if it's, if something goes a little bit wrong, then we have some adjustments to make. But we're going to come into it with like a, whether it's a bike setup or nutrition plan or pacing strategy, with the mindset of like, we think this is the right approach for our A race, or some modification to accommodate whatever the B race demands are. But it's gonna mostly simulate what we're trying to do on race day, and see what happens. So we're still setting up for like, we want to have the best day possible, but there's like there's less at stake because it's not the race that you care most about.
Yeah. And I think ideally too, it would be nice if B races were similar to the demands of your A race.
Yes.
Whereas maybe a C race could be just something you're doing for fun, right?
Right.
Like maybe you're training for crits or something, but somebody, your buddy called you up and he's like, hey, let's do this 24-hour mountain bike race together. Like that doesn't meet the demands of a crit at all, but you want to do it. So you do it, and it's a C race.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I totally agree. Yep. Yeah. So one other thing that I was going to mention here, I feel like, and so I'll do this with my athletes, but let me explain it first. So I feel like a lot of people, especially if you're self-coached, you fall into this mindset of training weeks have to fall Monday through Sunday, and you cannot deviate from that. So it's the like in this case for Evan here, it's like I either add another full week or I don't add another full week. And what I would like to push back on is like, why not just add a few days, add like Monday through Wednesday or Monday through Thursday, and then you could give yourself rest Friday to Monday, Friday to Tuesday, and you're kind of like breaking up that rest week. And then you can have your taper into your event, or have a normal training week coming into your event. So like you're basically just offsetting that rest week by half a week instead of a full week. And I'll do this with my athletes without them really knowing it per se. Like I'll just like, this is how I would plan it out. And I'm looking at it big picture. And as long as I know their schedule and I know it's not going to like completely mess up whatever their, daily routine is, I'll just shift it. And I'll be like, all right, we're going to take rest Monday through Friday this week, or we're going to take rest Wednesday through Saturday this week, because that's what we need right now. And we're just going to give you some rest. It's not going to fall on a Monday through Sunday schedule. But I'd rather like get in a couple extra days of training, or I'd rather like resume training before this next race a couple days in advance, knowing like we've got time to rest afterwards, things like that. It doesn't have to look perfectly aligned with a calendar week, unless for whatever reason you're talking like, and I would say it doesn't. I don't even care what your schedule is. Like, really, all you're doing is changing what the workout itself is. You're not necessarily like, swapping days per se. You're just, instead of doing intervals, you're taking a rest day, or instead of doing a rest day, you're doing intervals. So you're still utilizing the same time frame. It's just how you're structuring that workout changes. So that's one other option too for you, Evan, is like, if you're concerned about racing, and you shouldn't be, because we just talked about it, but sorry, it's not Evan, DJ. Keep saying Evan, that's the next question. DJ, sorry. If you're concerned about, that extra week contributing to like too much fatigue, and like whether or not you're going to be able to bounce back from that, you can always just add 2 days, 3 days, half a week, or whatever, and accommodate it that way.
Yeah.
Agreed. And ideally, so like I've also had some athletes that don't really they don't have to abide by a 7-day calendar week, because whether it's, they don't have strict work obligations, or, whatever it is, they can, their time and schedule allows for them to have a non-traditional weekly program. And I think like the ideal program would actually be more like 6 days. Or 10 days, like 2 5-day cycles. Like 7 days actually doesn't work out great a lot of times, but because most people have 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and they have to take advantage of weekends and things like that, that's typically how we build the program to start with. But I would much prefer to like not be confined to those 7 days.
Yeah. Me personally, I do 8-day cycles. So I do 3 days on, 1 day off, 3 days on, 1 day off. So that's 8 days. That's not 7.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So sometimes, like in that case, sometimes that means you're not hitting the local group ride on a Saturday, because Saturday happens to be your rest day that week. But that's just, for you, that's what works best. And I agree. I think some of those more non-traditional weekly structures, or just micro structures, is going to end up working out better.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's actually move on to Evan's question now. So this is question number 3. Evan says, I'm training for a couple 200-mile gravel races this summer. I have time to train between 10 to 12 hours each week, but due to my work schedule, I get nearly 50% of my weekly volume in one single long ride, as I currently only get 1 day off per week, and I can only fit shorter rides of 60 to 75 minutes on the days that I work. What's the best way to structure my training in these circumstances? So far, I haven't had trouble recovering from the weekly long ride, but with so much of my weekly volume wrapped up in a single session, I want to be sure I'm getting it right. Thanks, guys. Love the podcast. So I thought this was a really interesting question.
Yeah. If you had unlimited time, not necessarily the way I would structure it, but given your schedule, not a terrible way to do it. At the very least, you're going to be if you do one really long ride per week, you're going to be very used to riding for a very long time, as opposed to spreading it out more evenly. And let's say you only rode 2 or 3 hours a day most days, and then you never rode long. So there is that. I think that, as far as how I would structure that particular week, I think that the long ride would be zone 2 most of the time. I could see an argument for maybe doing the long ride a race-specific day as you get closer to the race. But I think most of the time the long ride should be zone 2, probably a recovery day immediately following it, and then the intensity for your week is going to be sprinkled throughout those shorter rides that you do. Probably, let's say, I don't know what days you can do your long ride, but let's say you do your long ride on Saturday, and then every other day of the week you can only ride, I don't know, an hour or something. I would do long ride Saturday, probably rest Sunday, and then maybe some intensity Monday, a ride Tuesday, a shorter endurance ride Tuesday, shorter endurance ride Wednesday, rest day Thursday, and then some intensity Friday, and then you're back to your long ride on Saturday.
Yeah. I kind of like that. I like that approach a lot. How would you structure, or what would you focus on for those 1 hour intensity sessions? Knowing that it's never going to be race specific because it's only an hour instead of 12 hours. But what could he do to maximize that hour that he's got with those intensity sessions?
Yeah, well, I mean, it really depends on what phase of your training cycle you're in. I mean, you should not do the same training every single week, because that's how you hit a plateau. So, I mean, I think if you want to follow normal periodization, meaning generally intensity is increasing, you could start with tempo and then do threshold and then do VO2 max. You could go that route. You could try reverse periodization if you wanted to. I could see an argument for doing reverse periodization in this case, where you're starting with high intensity, and then maybe by the time you're getting close to your race, since you are training for a long race, you're actually making the long ride your race specific day, and on that long ride you're doing some tempo efforts.
Yeah.
Whereas, earlier on in the season, that long ride was just endurance, and then on your intensity days you were doing VO2 max. You could go that route. But the thing that I'll say about the intensity days is you shouldn't be doing the same intensity workouts every single week in and week out.
Right.
They should be changing over time.
Yeah. I mean, in this case here, I would almost plan it like, say Evan builds up to doing, basically for your tempo and threshold session, since you've only got an hour and some change to work with, you're basically building up until you can accommodate as much threshold or tempo within that 1 hour session, and then just move on to the next, whatever the next energy system is. So don't spend too much where you're like doing 3x15 tempo, because once you hit that point, it's like the next thing you need is just more time during those sessions to get more stimulus. So just move on to the next, structure. So, and I kind of like the idea of doing, and I don't know, maybe it's a little bit too deep into his season already, because Evan says it's this summer. Although he just sent this question in recently, but he says it's this summer, so I don't know how much, where he's at in his training right now. But I would think in this case here, it would make more sense probably to do more of a reverse periodized approach, because you can, parlay those tempo sessions. If you need more time, you can just start taking some time away from your Saturday rides. So you're not trying to work too many different energy systems at one time. You could also try the approach. I know it's generally not considered to be best to introduce like a third day of intensity, but if you get to the point where those 2 1 hour sessions are not, you're kind of tapped out, you could start doing like a little bit of tempo on those back-to-back days, and maybe you just do that as part of your like race specificity anyways, because you're not going to be preparing by doing 200-mile rides on Saturday. So you could also try, especially if you're doing tempo work, you could try, instead of doing the 2 intensity sessions during the week where you're doing the 2 1 hour sessions, maybe it's back-to-back days, Friday and Saturday, and you're kind of getting the most between those 2 days. But it is tricky though, because I would want to see my athletes maximizing their aerobic adaptations from that long ride. So I wouldn't want to have that long ride be an intensity session for too long. That truly does have to be more of like a race specificity case, because you want to be able to use that long ride to build your aerobic base. And as soon as you start throwing some intensity in there, it's just going to break down the quality of that aerobic session.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I put the caveat in there. I would say the majority of the year, that should just be a zone 2 day.
Yep.
But the exception to that is like maybe you get into the last month before the race or the last 2 months before the race. You could start tweaking that so it's a little more race specific.
Yeah, I agree. All right, cool. You want to do one more, or you want to wrap it?
I got to go for a bike ride. So.
All right, wrap it there. Sweet, man.
Yeah.
All right, thanks everyone. Catch you next week.
Yeah, see ya.